The 1990s and early 2000s were an unusual period in history for one key reason. It was the first time the world had only a single dominant superpower. Throughout most of human history, multiple factions fought fiercely over even small regions, and major empires often struggled to control more than a portion of a single continent. But after the World Wars, the number of major powers sharply declined, from fewer than 10 before World War I to just 1 after the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States of America. From the Soviet Union's fall up to the 2008 financial crisis, the U.S. stood as the leading military force on the planet. No nation before or since has matched the level of technological, military, economic, political, and cultural influence the United States held in those years. Yet, due to a mix of poor leadership and the natural tendency for power vacuums to fill, this unipolar era eventually came to an end. Today we live in a bipolar world, defined by two primary powers, China and the United States. Each leads a wide network of smaller allied nations. Even so, this arrangement is already shifting. Current trends suggest we are moving toward a multipolar world, one that resembles the past, where numerous regional powers compete for influence. In this video, I'll discuss the countries I believe are most likely to become significant powers. The list is organized by how realistic it is for each nation to rise as a regional political force. China is not included here because it deserves its own dedicated video. With that clarified, let's begin. Before we dive in, this video is sponsored by the Overlord series by Josh Dunn. It's an excellent fantasy series about a tech enthusiast who gets transported into a magical world and gains extraordinary powers. He uses these abilities to challenge an oppressive theocracy that dominates the continent. Along the way, he embarks on wild adventures accompanied by a massive sentient tower that fuels his power and a talking Labrador. I found the book enjoyable on nearly every level. The characters are believable and likable, which is rare in many fantasy and sci-fi works. I also appreciated Josh's fast-paced writing style and the frequent bits of humor that keep the story engaging. As someone who enjoys history, one problem I often see in fantasy is that many fictional societies don't function logically. That's not the case here. The world is well designed, and the magic system is thoughtfully developed. Josh and I currently share royalties, so by clicking the link in the description and purchasing the book, you directly support my work as well. We're also giving away a few Tower Lords t-shirts. To enter, simply tweet me or Josh Dunn with a photo of the book or a screenshot of the first page, and we'll select several winners. So be sure to tag both of us, click the link in the description, and start reading today. In many ways, I see this video as the counterpart to my 5 countries that will collapse before 2040 discussion. The core idea remains the same. A period of global instability is approaching, where some nations will decline while others will experience significant progress. This list focuses on the countries that are likely to benefit from that shift, those capable of navigating the turbulence and establishing strong positions in the emerging world order. Several major factors shape these outcomes, many of which I've explored in previous videos in this geopolitics series, such as why the 2020s and 2030s are marked by rising conflict. A key element here is that the United States is entering a more isolationist phase. I've explained this in earlier geopolitical breakdowns, but the essential point is that economic, demographic, and strategic trends are all pushing the U.S. to reduce its involvement outside the developed world and the Americas. Both Republicans and Democrats increasingly favor policies that pull the country inward. I don't expect the U.S. to fully abandon Europe, and it will certainly continue to confront China. However, Washington is likely to scale back its engagement in the Middle East now that it is energy independent, as well as its attention toward Africa. Most people underestimate just how much influence the U.S. global security umbrella has had. The American military system underpinned the entire post-World War II order by safeguarding global trade routes and protecting weaker states from external aggression. This framework created a historic era of stability and international economic cooperation. That system is now approaching its end. Combined with several other trends we will discuss throughout this video, this shift will open opportunities for certain nations to rise as major actors on the world stage. I've ranked these countries from those I consider the least likely to those I view as the strongest candidates to become great powers in the next 60 years. Number 6. The East African Federation. This is an unusual case, one of those low-probability, high-impact developments. I don't place heavy confidence in its long-term prospects, but it does have roughly a 1 in 10 chance of emerging as a significant power. To begin with, the very idea of this federation coming into existence feels surprising and somewhat improbable. Yet, as things currently stand, it appears poised to happen. Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan are expected to merge into a single large state, forming the East African Federation, with Arusha in Tanzania serving as its capital. If this union becomes reality, it would mark the most substantial redrawing of borders since the breakup of the Soviet Union. This unified country would have a population of roughly 190 million, making it the 8th most populous nation in the world. I'll begin by explaining the factors that make this outcome unlikely, and then move to the reasons why, if it does happen, the potential could be enormous. The main challenge is the difficulty of merging 6 separate nations. Political elites everywhere, and especially in Africa, are generally reluctant to surrender power. Large, ambitious unification projects often fail on the continent due to corruption, local interests, and fragmented governance. However, the East African Federation would also have notable strengths. One of the most significant is that none of the national identities in this region are particularly deep-rooted. For example, uniting Europe into in contrast with the partial exceptions of Uganda and Rwanda, which had some form of proto-state structures, all the countries in this region were artificially formed by European colonial powers. Because these national identities are relatively modern, replacing them with a larger shared identity may be easier and less disruptive. A major issue for many African nations is that tribal affiliations remain far more influential than national identity. As a result, numerous African countries end up dominated by a single tribe, which then suppresses others. The ideological conflicts of the Cold War in Africa often appear almost ironic, as many of those communist versus democratic struggles were essentially tribal contests where each side used political labels to secure foreign weapons. However, forming a large enough state could reduce the power of any one tribe, preventing domination by a single group. Historically, large multi-ethnic empires, such as the Romans, the Han Chinese, and the Arab caliphates, gradually dissolved tribal divisions by creating broader cultural structures capable of holding diverse populations together. To develop a stable civilization, societies need mechanisms that can manage populations beyond the tribal level. Most countries in this region only have about a century of statehood behind them. Yet Tanzania and Rwanda stand out for their relatively strong records in fairness, governance, and economic freedom. If those institutional strengths were successfully extended across the whole federation, the outlook would be quite positive. Some member states also rank among the fastest-growing economies in the world, though their rapid growth must be viewed in the context of starting from a low economic base. Overall, I tend to be cautiously optimistic about Africa's potential to form a larger political unit once the current US-backed international system, one that treats existing national borders as untouchable, loses influence. Modern African realities make more sense either at the tribal level or under a broader imperial-style framework. Sub-Saharan Africa currently has about 50 countries and very little history of continent-wide empires. Once external constraints fade, the region may become a testing ground for new state-building models. With so many culturally diverse nations, the chances are not insignificant that one might eventually produce a leader comparable to a Harun al-Rashid, a Charlemagne, or an Augustus. It may not ultimately be the East African Federation, but at this point, they appear to be the most likely candidate among all possible options. Historically, empires tend to form along the edges of previously developed regions. Almost every major state emerged this way. Conflict on the borders of advanced societies unified groups, and those new states adopted the technologies and organizational methods of their more developed neighbors. If states are allowed to compete freely, the strongest eventually prevail and absorb useful innovations from those around them. In a Hobbesian world without the stabilizing influence of the United States, this process is likely to unfold somewhere in Africa. A crucial point is that modern technology is finally overcoming many of the geographic challenges that once made tropical Africa difficult to develop. As recently as 1950, large parts of Tanzania were virtually uninhabitable due to severe disease burdens. Since then, agricultural productivity in Africa has increased fivefold. Diseases like malaria and sleeping sickness, which once prevented the rise of large cities, can now be eliminated at the national level. Africa also historically lacked navigable rivers and draft animals, which severely limited transportation and communication. Today, railways and highways can overcome those constraints. Geographically, The East African Federation would have several advantages. The highlands in Kenya and Tanzania offer temperate climates. The region includes South Sudan's oil reserves, and it has access to the coast. It also lacks highly threatening neighbors, with the possible exception of Ethiopia decades down the line. If a stable empire eventually emerges in Africa, it could grow into a major global power. With internal stability, the rest of the continent would likely use it as an economic hub, and surrounding countries could fall under its influence in exchange for protection. In a world with greater disorder and without America as global guardian, such stability would be extremely valuable. People often mock Africa for its poverty, but I think that perspective ignores critical context. Just 120 years ago, much of East Africa was essentially an Iron Age, largely illiterate society, roughly on par with Britain before the Roman conquest. Given that starting point, Africa's progress has been remarkable. That said, I don't expect the continent's future to be smooth. Climate change will make parts of Africa drier, and combined with malnutrition pressures, the continent is likely to face a major crisis at some point in the 21st century. Still, by the end of the century, I believe an African empire will exist, with the East African Federation being the most likely candidate. Number 5. Iran. Iran has long been a major power. If you exclude the 20th century and the late 19th century, there has hardly been a period since the time of Socrates when Iran wasn't among the world's top 10, and often top 5 most powerful nations. This status comes from the exceptional diplomatic abilities of the Iranian people. Since the era of Cyrus the Great, Iran has demonstrated a unique capacity to use diplomacy not just defensively but as an offensive tool. By dividing their rivals and preventing coordinated attacks, Iran has consistently used strategy to its advantage. A major factor behind Iran's long-term success is its mountainous terrain, which has helped it preserve independence throughout history. These same mountains also prevented Iran from being fully subdued by outside powers, meaning Iranians have retained a reputation as strong, capable fighters. In contrast, countries like Iraq, Syria, and Egypt have populations concentrated in fertile river valleys. After thousands of years of foreign domination, these societies often struggle to form cohesive and resilient military forces. I sometimes think of Iran's foreign policy over the past 40 years as similar. Iran is one of the few countries with a Shia Muslim majority, and it has skillfully used the role of protector of Shia communities to expand its influence. Today, Iran holds considerable sway in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria, essentially across much of the Middle East. For a country that is relatively weak in material terms, this level of influence is extraordinary. However, Iran's internal situation has been its greatest vulnerability. The country has faced a severe economic downturn, with unemployment hovering around 14%. Much of this is the result of U.S. sanctions, though a significant share stems from mismanagement by the Islamic clerical leadership. This tension forms the central question of Iran's future potential. As a nation, Iran possesses enormous capacity to rise as a major power, but its current leadership is unlikely to guide it effectively. Iran has a highly educated population and is roughly halfway through industrialization, putting it ahead of most countries in its region. At the same time, the Middle East is an area the United States is steadily withdrawing from. With America now energy independent and weary of Middle Eastern conflicts after September 11th, Washington has far less incentive to stay involved. Historically, large empires have dominated this region, and more often than not, those empires were Iranian. Afghanistan is a failed state and Pakistan faces severe risks to its long-term stability due to resource pressures, internal divisions, hostile neighbors, weak geographic defenses, and persistent governance challenges. Similarly, Central Asia is expected to face severe challenges in the coming decades due to overpopulation, climate change, and widespread government corruption. As a result, Iran naturally emerges as the leading power in a region that is steadily destabilizing around it. Number 4. Ethiopia. Unlike most of sub-Saharan Africa, which had very limited traditions of centralized states before European colonization in the 1900s, Ethiopia stands as a major exception. It has functioned as a developed, unified, and centralized nation since roughly 500 BC, give or take a few centuries. In the period before the rise of Islam, Ethiopia was considered one of the more influential powers in the world. Today, Ethiopia holds a strategically strong position in its region for several reasons. One of the most important is geography. Despite lying close to the equator, Its highland terrain gives it a Mediterranean-style climate similar to Greece or Egypt. Additionally, unlike any nearby country for a great distance, Ethiopia is currently undergoing industrialization. The old stereotype of widespread famine no longer reflects reality, as Ethiopia has recorded some of the fastest economic growth rates in the world over the past decade. Ethiopia is also constructing major dams on the Nile, which, if successfully completed, will grant it critical influence over downstream nations such as Egypt. Its rugged mountain landscape makes invasion extremely difficult, and its population has a reputation for being formidable fighters. Aside from a potential East African Union, no regional power is strong enough to counter Ethiopia. Somalia and South Sudan function as failed states, while Sudan remains closely aligned with Ethiopian interests. For this reason, the Horn of Africa is one of the few regions where the United States would welcome the emergence of a strong local power. Such a country could help curb Somali piracy and address the ongoing crises in Yemen and South Sudan. Despite being landlocked, Ethiopia has already begun developing a navy stationed in Djibouti to monitor the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. Djibouti effectively serves as Ethiopia's coastline, since Somalia is unstable and Eritrea remains deeply hostile toward them. A significant challenge for Ethiopia continues to be internal ethnic divisions. Although the Ethiopian state has existed for centuries, it has struggled to fully integrate its many tribes. These tensions contributed to the recent civil war, with the Tigray region rising in rebellion. However, modern infrastructure, such as rail lines and highways, is helping connect Ethiopia's scattered mountain communities, making national unity more achievable. Historically, civil wars often pave the way for stronger central authority, as one elite faction ultimately prevails and governs without opposition. This pattern is consistent with the American, Russian, and British civil wars, which all preceded periods of national expansion. Number 3. India presents a unique case when analyzing its geopolitical future. It holds several significant strengths, yet it also carries some notable weaknesses. One major factor, in my view, is that historically India has shown a surprisingly low level of outward aggression. The Gangetic Plain, for much of history, was ruled by foreign dynasties, and India has launched military campaigns outside the subcontinent only once, during the High Medieval period, when the Chola Empire extended its influence as far as Indonesia. India's historical military performance has generally been poor. Although records from ancient eras are incomplete, it is clear that India has lost far more wars than it has won. This pattern appears consistently throughout Indian history. While modern reports suggest that India's military leadership is strong today, the country has still struggled to establish and maintain a steady, assertive foreign policy. This lack of strategic direction allowed China to surround India with a network of allied states and bases. If I were part of the Indian government, I would have taken extremely serious action against those who enabled China to secure port access in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. Overall, China remains one of India's most significant obstacles. China is wealthier, more organized, and considerably more powerful. You can compare statistics endlessly, but the differences are obvious even by simply observing street-level views of both countries. China is also constructing dams near the headwaters of major rivers like the Brahmaputra, Ganges, and Indus. If China gains effective control over these systems, India could become. Surprisingly, India has taken full advantage of this only once in its history, again during the era of the Cholas. But if India can overcome its internal and external challenges, it could eventually become the leading naval power across a vast stretch of territory from East Africa to Indonesia. The United States would not do much to prevent this, mainly because it no longer sees this region as a strategic priority, and also because India is a democratic nation and a reliable ally. Economically and socially, India presents a very mixed picture. I'll admit that I don't fully understand India, so take these observations cautiously. From what I've seen, India is industrializing, but the process is far less orderly than what we observed in the East Asian tiger economies. Growth, both economic and social, is happening, yet it tends to be uneven and inconsistent. India has advanced high-tech industries while at the same time, a significant share of the population lives in conditions resembling the Iron Age, with millions still trapped in forms of bonded labor. In many ways, it resembles Tsarist Russia before World War I, making it difficult to pinpoint the country's exact level of development. It's equally challenging to evaluate India's national cohesion. As a unified nation-state, India is only about 80 years old. The idea of India existed before that, but more as a cultural or religious concept, similar to how Christendom functioned in medieval Europe. In the event of a major conflict, it is unclear how committed the average rural citizen would be, or whether they would feel strongly about issues beyond their own village. Ultimately, this raises a blunt question. Does India have enough societal unity to function as a true superpower? If India does manage to build strong internal cohesion, its massive size becomes a major advantage throughout the lands south of the Himalayas. India also has a large, growing, and relatively young population, a significant long-term benefit, especially when compared with China's severe aging crisis, which will worsen in the coming decades. India's neighbors could also become strategic assets if India strengthens its economic influence. Bangladesh, located within the Gangetic Plain, would naturally fall into the economic orbit of a wealthier India. Sri Lanka likely would as well. Myanmar is a major rice producer and could develop a mutually beneficial relationship by serving India's enormous food market. And as mentioned earlier, Pakistan's internal challenges are so profound that, should India remain stable, it may eventually fall into India's sphere of influence by the end of the century. Modern Indian nationalism is heavily shaped by Hindu identity, but historically, this has not been the norm. If India becomes more prosperous, it may shift back toward a broader civilizational identity, one that is cultural rather than religious, and potentially more inclusive even of Pakistan, rather than one that defines itself by exclusion. Number 2. France. This may come as a surprise, but France is already something close to a global power. France has maintained substantial influence over many of its former African colonies. It controls the currencies used in West Africa, keeps strong leverage over several regional governments, and intervenes militarily when it chooses. At the moment, France is engaged in 4 military operations across Africa to prevent jihadist groups from taking control of the Sahel. France is also involved in Libya, and as the United States continues to withdraw from global responsibilities, it's unlikely that the U.S. will fully pull out of Europe. One reason is that, as long as the U.S. remains a majority white nation, which, contrary to common belief, will not change anytime soon, it is unlikely to abandon its European partners. Another major factor is that Americans often grow frustrated with international commitments that don't align with their national interests. Europe, however, represents roughly a quarter of the world's economy, making it valuable enough for the U.S. to maintain its involvement. I see 3 potential scenarios for the future U.S.-Europe relationship, which I will discuss more thoroughly in another video. The most likely, in my view, is that European nations begin offering something close to tribute payments in exchange for continued American protection. A second possibility is that Europe develops its own defense systems while still maintaining an alliance with the United States. The third and least probable outcome is that the U.S. fully withdraws and leaves Europe to manage on its own. Among Western European nations, France is the least pacified. The United Kingdom is deeply tied to the U.S. for cultural reasons, and Germany, under its older leadership, is unlikely to rearm. Meanwhile, Germany's extremely low birth rate suggests its younger population will soon face aging challenges similar to Japan's. France, on the other hand, is the most independent from the U.S. in terms of foreign policy, having once withdrawn from NATO's integrated command structure. It also has one of the healthiest demographic profiles in Europe. Another major shift is that the U.S. no longer has a strong reason to protect the oil supply of its allies. For Europe, this is a serious problem, as much of its oil comes either from the unstable Middle East or from Russia, which offers energy with significant political strings attached. The U.S. also has little strategic interest in the Mediterranean region, since the countries most important to American interests sit along the Atlantic. These factors create opportunities for France, which could emerge as the primary security provider in the Mediterranean, strengthening ties with Spain and Italy. This would appeal to France's desire for influence while reducing America's burden. Elsewhere, I have predicted that Egypt may face collapse in the near future due to demographic and environmental pressures. If that happens, someone will need to ensure the Suez Canal remains open, and France is as likely a candidate as any. France could also help secure Europe's energy needs by expanding its influence across North and West Africa and by maintaining a presence near the Suez, giving it access to oil from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. I can also imagine France stepping in to manage the region's growing instability. France could also try carving out the coastal, oil-rich Igbo region of Nigeria as an independent state, adding it to its broader West African sphere of influence. A major advantage here is that the United States and France make effective partners. Both countries share similar values and belong to the same cultural tradition. Despite frequent disagreements, they fundamentally respect each other, and Americans would generally be comfortable allowing France to manage regions outside core U.S. interests. Number 1. Turkey. This one has become a bit of a meme. I'm often teased for being a Turkophile, partly because I admire the Ottoman Empire and partly because I keep insisting that Turkey is on the verge of becoming a major power. But hear me out, Turkey has significant advantages, especially compared to the nations around it. Turkey has a relatively industrialized economy, a large and growing young population, a unifying national ideology rooted in Turkish nationalism and Islam, and a capable military. At the same time, it is surrounded by weaker states. The Balkan countries have struggling, often corrupt economies and some of the oldest, fastest shrinking populations in the world. These nations are not positioned to rise anytime soon, and their geography naturally orients them toward the Black Sea and Istanbul. The United States likely wouldn't intervene, as long as it can maintain a secure defensive line for the more western-aligned parts of Central Europe, which it could hold at the Belgrade Mountain Pass. Russia, with its declining population, fragile economy, and fragmented national resolve, is in a similarly vulnerable state. Georgia and Armenia face comparable challenges. Turkey could potentially dominate the entire Black Sea region, including by asserting authority over Crimea. It could also use Turkic ethnic minorities to extend its influence, such as the Azeris in Iran or the Chechens and Tatars in Russia, groups that continue gaining political weight due to higher birth rates. Chechnya is already nearly self-governing, and it's easy to imagine a future where it seeks a better arrangement with Turkey rather than remaining tied to Russia. To the south, Turkey is already controlling much of Iraq's water supply by constructing dams on the Tigris and Euphrates, giving it significant leverage over a country largely dependent on those rivers. Syria is effectively a failed state and would not be difficult for Turkey to dominate militarily. As discussed in a previous video, I believe Saudi Arabia and Egypt may be nearing collapse due to demographic and environmental pressures. Both nations have flat terrain, discontented populations, and historically weak militaries, making them comparatively easy targets. Major powers, including the United States, would likely tolerate Turkish expansion because, overall, Turkey is seen as a more stable and preferable option than most other regimes in the region, though there would certainly be exceptions, particularly among groups like Armenians and Bulgarians. Erdogan's aggressive rhetoric has also strained. By controlling this region, Turkey would also gain access to a large portion of the world's oil reserves, a factor that would significantly elevate its global influence. Historically, waves of industrialization have followed certain cultural patterns, first centered around proximity to Britain, then around Japan. Now that Turkey has industrialized, a similar trend. Alternatively, feel free to browse the show's merchandise, including maps, mugs, and branded t-shirts. As always, thank you for watching, and have a great day. 30-second short script English. As global power shifts accelerate, Turkey stands out as one of the few nations capable of shaping real stability in its region. Despite rising debt and political tensions, Turkey's strategic location ensures that major powers, especially China, would still support it when necessary. Much of its debt is tied to long-term infrastructure, giving the country durable strength. With influence across the Sunni world, control of key energy routes, and a growing industrial base, Turkey is positioned to expand its regional role. As neighboring Arab populations continue to grow, they form a natural market for Turkish industry. Altogether, these factors suggest Turkey may rise as a significant power in the coming decades.